The smell of sour milk and stomach acid was thick in the small Oakland kitchen. Elias Miller was on his hands and knees, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the linoleum floor. He dipped a rag into a bucket of gray, soapy water and squeezed it out, his knuckles turning white. As he scrubbed, his gold wedding band slipped loosely around his finger. He stopped for a second, pushing the ring back up with his thumb. He had lost weight over the last year, too many skipped dinners to make sure Leo had enough. "I'm sorry, Dad," Leo said from the sofa, his voice small and raspy. Elias looked over his shoulder. Leo was 7, but curled up under that fleece blanket, he looked like a toddler again. His eyes were glassy with fever. "Don't worry about it, Leo. Floors can be washed. You just focus on resting." Elias turned back to the floor, his eyes landing on a framed photo sitting on the counter, just out of reach of the mess. It was a picture from 5 years ago. In it, Elias was wearing a clean button-down shirt, laughing as he held a trophy for Teacher of the Year at the local high school. Sarah was standing next to him, her eyes bright with pride. Back then, Elias Miller was a man with a career he loved and a wife who made the world feel safe. He taught biology, spent his weekends hiking, and never worried about the cost of a doctor's visit. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday night when a car ignored a stop sign. Sarah was gone, and the Teacher of the Year died with her. Elias couldn't face a classroom anymore. Every teenager reminded him of the future his wife would never see. He had traded his passion for a soul-crushing job in the filing basement of Sterling Genomics in downtown San Francisco. It wasn't because he liked data, it was because Sterling had the best health insurance in the state, and Leo, with his chronic asthma and weak immune system, needed that insurance to stay alive. Elias wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of gray water on his skin. He felt every bit of his 36 years. He was no longer the man in that photo. He was just a guy trying to keep his head above water. His phone buzzed on the counter, vibrating next to the photo of Sarah. Elias stood up, his knees cracking like dry twigs. He wiped his hands on his faded jeans and picked it up. It was a text from Pete. "Pete, dude, you're still cooped up in that house? You need to breathe. Call that girl from the bookstore. Sarah wouldn't want you living like a ghost." Elias leaned his lower back against the counter, staring at the floor he hadn't finished cleaning. He didn't want a date. He didn't want to explain to a stranger why he worked in a basement or why he still wore a wedding ring 4 years later. He was just tired. He was so incredibly lonely. He opened the message thread, his thumbs hovering over the glass. He didn't really mean to reply to Pete. He just started typing, letting the exhaustion and the weight of the day turn into words. "I just wish you were here tonight," Elias typed, his chest tightening. "We could sit on the sofa and not say a word. I want to lean my head on your shoulder, feel your hand, and know I'm not carrying the whole world by myself. I miss feeling safe with someone." He stared at the words. They were too honest, too desperate. He went to hit the backspace key, but Leo let out a sharp, wet cough. "Dad, can I have more water?" "Yeah, buddy." "Hang on." Elias reached for a clean glass with his left hand while trying to set the phone down with his right. His thumb brushed the screen. He saw the blue arrow flicker. He didn't think much of it until he glanced at the name at the top of the chat. It wasn't Pete. The name in bold, clinical letters was Claire Sterling, the CEO, the woman who owned the skyscraper, the woman who had never spoken a word to him in 3 years. Elias had sent a digitized file to her assistant's shared folder earlier that morning, and her contact must have been pinned to the top of his list. "Oh, no," Elias whispered. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt very thin. He scrambled to grab the phone, his fingers still damp with soapy residue. He tried to find an unsend button, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but it was too late. A small bubble appeared under the text. "Read." It was 3:17 p.m. Claire Sterling was probably at her mahogany desk in the financial district, and she had just read that her basement clerk wanted to lean on her shoulder. Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just embarrassing. This was a death warrant. In the corporate world of Sterling Genomics, a message like this from a low-level employee was inappropriate conduct, or sexual harassment. Grant, the HR director who already treated Elias like a bug under his shoe, would have the termination papers ready by sunset. He would lose his job. He would lose the insurance. Leo would lose his doctors. "Dad, your face is white. Are you sick too?" Leo asked. Elias couldn't find his voice. His hands were shaking so violently that the phone rattled against his palm. He tried to grip it tighter, but the soap on his skin made the glass back slide like ice. The phone tumbled out of his hand, flipping through the air. It landed with a sickening splash directly into the bucket of dirty, puke-filled water. Elias stared into the bucket. A few bubbles rose to the surface, and the screen flickered once before going pitch black. He didn't reach in to save it. He just stood there, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, staring at the gray water. "I'm fired," Elias said to the empty room. "What?" Leo asked. Elias forced himself to take a breath. He looked at his son and tried to keep his face from crumbling. "Nothing. Leo, lie back down. I'll get your water." He walked to the sink, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He filled a glass. But his mind was 20 miles away, across the Bay Bridge. He wondered if Claire Sterling was calling security right now. He sat down on the kitchen floor, leaning his head against the cold cabinet. He didn't finish cleaning. He just watched the front door, waiting for the ceiling to fall in. 33 minutes. That was how long he had before his world changed forever. Elias stood over the bucket, staring at the spot where his phone had disappeared. The gray, soapy water was still. No more bubbles rose to the surface. He didn't reach in to grab it. His hands felt heavy, and his chest was tight. His mind was already miles away, back in the bright, clinical lobby of Sterling Genomics. He remembered the feeling of his heart dropping 8 hours ago. It was 7:15 a.m. Elias was walking through the Sanchin, carrying a heavy stack of files and his old, blue Tupperware container. The lobby was full of people in expensive suits. Grant Harrison, the HR director, was standing near the elevators with Tiffany, his secretary. Grant watched Elias approach. As Elias walked past, Grant moved his foot. It was a quick, deliberate motion. Elias stumbled. The files flew out of his arms, and the Tupperware hit the marble floor with a loud crack. The lid popped off. Cold pasta and red sauce splattered across the floor, some of it landing on Grant's polished leather shoes. Grant looked down at his feet. Tiffany stood next to him, her hand over her mouth. "Elias, did you find that lunch in a dumpster?" Grant asked. Elias dropped to his knees. He tried to gather the papers, but the sauce was everywhere. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison. I'll clean it up," Elias said. "Look at this mess. Do you bring trash from your house just to ruin my morning?" Elias didn't look up. He reached for a piece of pasta, but Grant stepped on his hand. He didn't put his full weight down, but it was enough to pin Elias to the floor. "Is money that tight, Elias? Are you so broke from buying meds for that burden of a kid that you can't buy a real sandwich?" Tiffany laughed. The sound echoed in the lobby. About 30 other employees were standing at the coffee station. They stopped talking and looked over. Then, they started laughing too. It was a low, steady sound that filled the room. "Leo isn't a burden," Elias whispered. "He's a drain on the company's insurance premiums, Miller. Everyone knows it. You're lucky we haven't found a reason to cut you loose yet." Grant pulled his foot away and wiped his shoe on the back of Elias's jacket. "Clean it up. You're making the lobby smell like poverty." Elias remembered the heat in his face as he scrubbed the marble. He remembered Tiffany recording him on her phone while she giggled. He had finished the job and gone down to the basement, hoping to stay invisible for the rest of the day. Now, standing in his kitchen in Oakland, that hope was dead. In America, the message he had just sent Claire Sterling was more than a mistake. It was a legal disaster. It was sexual harassment. The employee handbook was very clear about unsolicited personal messages of an intimate nature. Claire Sterling was the CEO. She had a team of lawyers on retainer. Grant would finally have the excuse he needed. He wouldn't just fire Elias. He would make sure Elias was blacklisted. If Elias lost his job, he lost his health insurance. He thought about the stack of medical bills on the counter. Leo had a specialist appointment next Thursday. The inhalers alone cost $500 a month. Without the Sterling Genomics Group plan, Leo wouldn't have a doctor. "Dad, are you okay?" Leo asked from the sofa. Elias blinked. He looked at the clock on the stove. 3:40 p.m. "I'm fine, Leo. I'm just going to clean up a bit." "You look scared." "I'm just tired, buddy." "Is the lady at work going to be mad about the message?" "I think she might be." "Will she take away your job?" Elias walked over to the sofa and tucked the blanket tighter around Leo's shoulders. "Don't worry about that. I'll figure it out. I always do." Elias went to the kitchen sink. He felt a strange, numb calm. He started washing the dishes from breakfast. He moved mechanically. He washed a cereal bowl, then a spoon, then a glass. He scrubbed each item 3 times. He dried them and put them away in perfect rows. He needed his hands to be busy. He kept looking at the window. He expected a police car to pull up. Maybe Claire had called the Oakland PD to report a stalker, or maybe a black SUV with private security guards would show up to hand him a restraining order. 3:47 p.m. 30 minutes had passed since he hit send. He walked into the living room and started picking up Leo's Lego bricks. He put them into the plastic bin, one by one. His movements were slow and steady. He was waiting for the end. He felt like a man standing on a pier, watching a tidal wave come toward him. There was nowhere to run. "Dad, there's a big car outside," Leo said. Elias froze. He didn't want to look. He stood up and walked to the front window. A black Rolls-Royce was parked at the curb. It was long and shiny, reflecting the gray afternoon light. It looked completely out of place in front of his small, weathered house with the peeling paint. The engine cut off, leaving the street in total silence. Elias looked at the clock. 3:50 p.m. It had been exactly 33 minutes since the message was read. "Is that her?" Leo asked. "I think so," Elias said. His heart was pounding against his ribs, but his body felt cold. He looked at his hands. They were still damp from the dishwater. He wiped them on his jeans. He thought about Grant's laugh in the lobby. He thought about the burden of his son's life. He walked toward the front door, his legs feeling heavy. He reached for the handle, but he didn't turn it yet. He just stood there, listening to the sound of a car door closing. "Whatever happens, Leo, stay on the couch," Elias said. "Is she going to hurt us?" "No. She's just here to finish things." Elias turned the lock. The click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. He opened the door. Claire Sterling was standing on his porch. She was wearing a black silk suit and a string of pearls. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight. She didn't have a lawyer with her. She didn't have security guards. She was holding her phone in one hand. Elias felt his throat close up. He looked at the woman who could destroy his entire world with a single phone call. "Miss Sterling," he said. Claire didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at Elias. Then her eyes moved past him into the house. She saw the mess, the bucket of gray water, and the small boy on the sofa. She looked back at Elias. "Elias Miller," she said. Elias stood in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at the woman standing on his porch, her presence far too large for the small neighborhood. The idle hum of the Rolls-Royce at the curb was the only sound on the quiet street. "Miss Sterling," Elias said. His voice was thin. "I am so sorry. I know why you are here. I will leave the company. I'll have my resignation on your desk by morning. Please, just don't involve the police. I was tired, and I sent the message to the wrong contact." "It was a mistake." Claire didn't answer. She didn't look angry, but she didn't smile either. She took a step forward. Elias instinctively moved back, opening the door wider. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past him into the small living room. The scent of expensive iris perfume followed her into the house. It was a sharp, clean smell that clashed instantly with the thick air of the home. The living room smelled like chicken soup and the medicinal sting of VapoRub. Claire stopped in the middle of the room and looked around. She saw the piles of laundry on the chair and the Lego bricks on the rug. Leo sat up on the sofa, clutching his unicorn blanket. His eyes were wide as he stared at the woman in the silk suit. "Is she the lady who's going to take our house, Dad?" Leo asked. Elias felt a pang in his chest. "No, Leo. Just lie back down." Claire looked at the boy, then at the sofa. It was a cheap piece of furniture with fabric that was pilling and worn thin at the armrests. She sat down at the far end, away from Leo's feet. She looked out of place, like a diamond sitting in a box of gravel, but she didn't make a face. Elias stayed by the door. He felt like a stranger in his own home. "What do you want, Miss Sterling? If you aren't here to fire me, why are you here?" Claire reached into the pocket of her vest. She pulled out 2 small items and set them on the coffee table. One was a crumpled yellow sticky note. The other was an old ginger tea bag, still in its paper wrapper. Elias stared at them. He felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. He had left those on her desk a week ago. He had stayed late to finish a filing project and saw her through her office window. She had looked defeated, her head resting in her hands. He hadn't thought she would ever find out who did it. "You left these," Claire said. "I saw you through the glass," Elias said. "You looked like you were having a hard day. I didn't think you would ever notice a tea bag from the break room." Claire picked up the note. She read the words out loud. "You look very tired. Don't overdo it." "I know it was unprofessional," Elias said. "I shouldn't have gone into your office." Claire looked up at him. "Do you know how many messages I receive every day, Elias?" "I'm sure it's a lot," Elias said. "They are all the same," Claire said. "People text me to ask for power. They want promotions. They want me to sign off on their budgets. They want me to destroy their competitors. Every person who talks to me is trying to get something from me." She looked down at her phone, then back at him. "Then I got your text today," Claire said. Elias looked at the floor. "I told you, that was a mistake. I was talking to a friend. I didn't mean to bother you with my life. You didn't bother me," Claire said. "In my world, everyone asks me for things. You are the only person who ever asked if I was tired. And today, you sent a message saying you just wanted a place to feel safe. You weren't asking for a raise. You were just being a human being." Elias leaned against the wall. He felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he was still confused. "I don't understand. You drove all the way to Oakland for a text message?" "I drove here because I realized I haven't felt safe in a long time either," Claire said. Leo coughed, a dry, raspy sound that shook his small frame. Claire turned her head and looked at the boy. She reached out and touched the corner of his blanket. "Grant told me your son was a liability to the company's insurance," Claire said. Elias felt his jaw tighten. "Grant doesn't know anything about my son. Leo is the reason I work. He isn't a liability." "I agree," Claire said. "Grant thinks people are just numbers on a spreadsheet. I used to think that too. My father raised me to believe that feelings were a waste of time. He told me that being a Sterling meant being a machine. That sounds like a lonely way to live," Elias said. "It is," Claire said. She looked around the room again. Her eyes lingered on a photo of Elias and Sarah on the mantel. Then she looked at the bucket of soapy water Elias had been using. "I'm not going to fire you, Elias Miller," Claire said. Elias let out a long, shaky breath. He felt like he might actually collapse. "Thank you. Truly. But I'm not leaving yet," Claire said. "You look like you haven't slept in a week, and Leo needs better medicine than what you have in that kitchen." "I'm doing my best," Elias said. "I know you are," Claire said. "Maybe that's why I'm here. I want to see what best looks like when it isn't about money." She leaned back against the worn sofa. The iris perfume was still there, but the smell of the soup gas seemed to settle around her. "Make that tea you mentioned on the note," Claire said. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Elias looked at his son, who was watching them both with curiosity. He then looked at the most powerful woman in San Francisco sitting in his living room. He didn't have an answer for why this was happening, but he walked toward the kitchen. "I'll put the kettle on," Elias said. "Good," Claire said. For the first time since she had arrived, Claire's face softened. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She just looked like a woman who was tired of being alone in a big building. Elias realized that the message he sent to the wrong person might have been the right message after all. The kettle whistled in the kitchen. a sharp sound that broke the heavy silence of the living room. Elias poured the boiling water over the fresh ginger he had sliced, the steam rising into his tired face. He carried the 2 mugs back to the sofa, sitting on the far edge while Claire held the warm ceramic between her hands. She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving the flickering light of the small lamp on the end table. "This house is small, but it's warm," Claire said. Elias looked at the peeling wallpaper in the corner. "It's all I could manage after Sarah died. The medical bills from the accident took the rest. I'm sorry, it's not what you're used to. My home was a mansion in Nob Hill," Claire said. "It was massive, 12 bedrooms, high ceilings, but it was freezing every single day. My father didn't believe in turning on the heat until December. He said it built character." "That sounds difficult for a child," Elias said. "It wasn't just the temperature," Claire said. "My mother passed away when I was 10. I remember sitting on the floor of my bedroom, clutching a teddy bear she had bought me for my birthday. I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe. My father walked in, but he didn't sit down. He didn't even touch my shoulder." Elias watched her. Her grip on the mug tightened until her knuckles were white. "He gathered all my stuffed animals," Claire continued, "every single one. He took them to the grand fireplace in the library and threw them in. He told me that Sterling women don't need crutches. He said, 'Sterling must not be weak.' Then he handed me a schedule for the next morning. He made me attend a board meeting while the funeral was still being planned. I was 10 years old, sitting in a room full of men in suits, trying to understand profit margins while my heart was in pieces." "I'm sorry, Claire," Elias said. "No one should have to grow up like that." "I never knew what it was like to feel safe," Claire said. "I thought safety was something you bought with insurance policies and security guards. I've spent 20 years building walls so high that no one could ever throw my things into a fire again. But sitting here, in this room that smells like soupga and medicine, I realized I've just been living in a bigger, more expensive version of that cold mansion." Elias leaned back, his shoulder touching the worn fabric of the sofa. "I lost Sarah 4 years ago. She was the one who made our world feel solid. When she died, the floor just fell out from under me. Every day since then has been a fight to keep Leo from seeing how scared I am." "He doesn't look scared," Claire said, glancing at the sleeping boy. "He looks like he trusts you completely." "That's the hardest part," Elias said. "Every morning I put on the mask. I'm the dad who has all the answers. I'm the guy who can fix the toys and handle the doctors. I tell him everything is going to be fine. But every night, once he's finally asleep, I go into the bathroom, I lock the door and turn on the shower, so the sound of the water hides my voice. And then I just cry. I break down until I can't feel anything anymore. Then I wash my face, walk out, and get ready to be Superman again the next day." Claire turned her head to look at him. For the first time, she didn't see the man who filed papers in the basement. She didn't see the man who had sent an embarrassing text message by mistake. She saw a man who had been through a war and stayed kind. She saw a man who worked a job he hated just to keep his son alive, and who still had enough room in his heart to worry if his billionaire boss was getting enough sleep. "You think you're weak because you cry in the bathroom," Claire said. "I feel like a fraud," Elias admitted. "My father had all the money in the world, and he was a coward," Claire said. "He was so afraid of pain that he destroyed a child's toys to avoid dealing with her grief. You face your pain every night, and then you get up and do it all again for your son. That isn't being a fraud, Elias. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Claire, and the distance between them seemed to vanish. She wasn't the Iron Lady of Sterling Genomics right now. She was just a woman who had been lonely for a very long time. "I didn't think anyone would understand," Elias said. "I didn't think I would ever tell anyone that story," Claire replied. She set her mug down on the coffee table. The steam had stopped rising, but the warmth remained in the air. She looked at the small, cluttered room again, but this time, she didn't see the mess. She saw a home. "Grant is wrong about you," Claire said. "He thinks value is something you measure in billable hours. He has no idea what you're actually worth." "I just want to be a good dad," Elias said. You are, Claire said. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and Leo's soft, rhythmic breathing. For a moment, the world outside the skyscrapers, the boardrooms, and the cruel jokes of men like Grant didn't exist. There was only the sofa, the ginger tea, and the fragments of two souls finally starting to pull themselves back together. Elias and Claire sat in the quiet for a long time after their conversation ended. The tea mugs were empty, but the feeling of being understood remained in the air between them. The heavy weight that usually sat on Elias's chest felt a little lighter. A soft rustle came from the end of the sofa. Leo stretched his arms out and blinked his eyes open. He looked at Elias. Then his gaze moved to Claire. He didn't look scared anymore. The fever had dropped enough to leave him curious. "Are you still here?" Leo asked. Claire looked down at the boy. "I am. How are you feeling?" "Thirsty. And my legs feel jumpy." "That's just the fever breaking," Elias said. He stood up to get a fresh glass of water, but Leo was already looking at a cardboard box sitting on the coffee table. It was a 3D puzzle of a telescope that Elias had bought for Leo's birthday but hadn't had the energy to start. "Dad, can we build the telescope now?" Leo asked. Elias looked at the clock. It was getting late. "Buddy, I think it's a bit too much for right now. Maybe tomorrow?" "I can help," Claire said. Elias looked at her in surprise. She was already moving. She stepped off the sofa and sat directly on the rug. She didn't seem to care that her silk suit was touching the dusty floorboards. She reached for the box and opened the tabs. "Come on, Leo," Claire said. "I used to be very good at puzzles." Leo slid off the sofa and joined her on the floor. Elias watched them, stunned. The most powerful woman in the city was sitting on her knees, punching out small pieces of cardboard. For the next hour, the room was filled with the sound of snapping tabs and Leo's quiet instructions. Claire followed them perfectly. She didn't take over. She let Leo lead. When the telescope was finally standing on its own 3 legs, Leo went to his desk and grabbed a pack of markers and a large drawing pad. He sat back down next to Claire. "We have to draw where the telescope is looking," Leo said. He began to draw a large, purple circle in the middle of the page. He colored it in with dark blue streaks. "That's a planet," Leo explained. "It's very far away. It's a lonely planet because there aren't any other planets in its system. It just sits there in the dark." Claire took a yellow marker from the pile. She leaned over the paper and drew a small, bright star right next to the purple planet. She added long, golden rays that reached out to touch the edges of the dark circle. "There," Claire said. "Now that planet isn't alone anymore. It has this star to protect it. The star stays close, so the planet doesn't have to be in the dark." Leo stared at the drawing for a long time. "The star won't go away? Even if the planet gets messy or breaks?" "The star stays," Claire said. "That's its job." Leo looked up at her and gave a small, shy nod. Elias felt his heart swell. He stood up to take the empty tea mugs to the kitchen, leaving them alone for a moment. Leo looked at his Apple Watch. It was a refurbished model Elias had bought so he could track Leo's location and call him during school. Leo tapped the screen and opened the contacts. He looked at Claire, then back at his watch. "Can I have your number?" Leo whispered. "Just in case?" Claire hesitated for a second, then leaned in. She whispered her private cell phone number to him. Leo typed it in with focused precision. When he got to the name field, he didn't type Claire. He typed The Guardian. Elias was still in the kitchen, rinsing the mugs. He couldn't hear what they were saying. Leo leaned closer to Claire, his voice barely audible. "My dad is sad a lot," Leo thumbed the. "He tries to hide it, but I see him. He cries in the bathroom when he thinks I'm asleep. He works so hard. But he's always worried." Claire's expression faltered. She looked at the kitchen doorway where Elias was standing with his back to them. "Please don't leave him," Leo whispered. "He needs a star, too." Claire looked at the small boy. She saw the honesty in his eyes, the same honesty she had seen in the text message Elias had sent by mistake. She reached out and tucked a stray hair behind Leo's ear. Then, Claire Sterling did something Elias hadn't seen in all his years at the company. She smiled. It wasn't a polite, corporate smile for a camera. It was a bright, genuine smile that reached her eyes and changed her entire face. The Ice Queen of San Francisco disappeared completely. "I'm not going anywhere, Leo," Claire said. Elias walked back into the room and stopped. He saw the smile, and for a second, he forgot how to breathe. Claire looked up at him, and the look in her eyes was no longer about business or pity. It was about something much deeper. "We finished the galaxy," Claire said. "It looks great," Elias replied, his voice a little thick. "I think I should go," Claire said, standing up and smoothing out her suit. "It's late, and this boy needs to sleep. Thank you for staying." Elias said, "For everything. I'll see you Monday, Elias," Claire said. "And Leo?" "Keep an eye on that star." Leo tapped his watch and grinned. "I will." Elias walked her to the door. As she stepped out into the cool Oakland night, she paused and looked back at him. "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Claire." He watched the red taillights of her car disappear down the street. When he closed the door, the house felt different. It was still small, and the wallpaper was still peeling, but the cold, heavy silence was gone. He looked at Leo, who was already heading back to the sofa with his new telescope. "She's nice, Dad," Leo said. "Yeah," Elias said, leaning against the door. "She really is." Monday morning at Sterling Genomics usually felt like walking into a freezer. Elias spent the commute across the Bay Bridge gripping the steering wheel, his mind replaying the weekend. He could still see Claire sitting on his rug, the purple marker in her hand as she drew a star for Leo. It didn't feel real. He expected to walk through the glass doors of the financial district and find a pink slip waiting for him. He expected the Ice Queen to have regained her frost. Elias went straight to the basement. He kept his head down and focused on the backlog of digitized records. By noon, his stomach started to growl. He had packed the leftovers of the lunch he made for Leo, a simple grilled cheese sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. He headed up to the company cafeteria, hoping to find a quiet corner. The cafeteria was a sea of white marble and chrome. It was a place for networking and power plays, not for a man with a foil-wrapped sandwich. Elias found a small table near the back, but before he could take a bite, a shadow fell over his lunch. "Is that your gourmet meal for the day, Miller?" Elias didn't have to look up. He knew Grant Harrison's voice. The HR director was standing there with Tiffany and a group of about 30 other employees. They had been laughing at something Tiffany said, but now their attention was fixed on Elias. "It's just a sandwich, Grant," Elias said. "It smells like a grease fire," Grant said. He leaned in closer, looking at the dented foil. "Does the company pay you so little that you have to eat like a middle schooler? Or did you spend the grocery money on more of those emergency doctor visits?" Tiffany giggled, and a few people in the crowd joined in. Elias felt the familiar heat rising in his neck. For 4 years, he had taken this. He had been the burden with the sick kid. "My son likes these," Elias said. "I made it for him." "That's touching," Grant said. He reached down and flicked the corner of the sandwich with his finger, but this is a professional environment. We have clients coming through. Seeing someone eat like a beggar in the main hall doesn't exactly scream innovation. Maybe you should take your trash back to the basement where it belongs. The crowd was quiet, waiting for Elias to move. He felt the weight of their eyes. He felt the old urge to apologize and disappear. But then, the room went completely silent. It wasn't the awkward silence of a joke failing. It was the heavy, breathless silence that happened whenever Claire Sterling entered a room. Elias looked toward the entrance. Claire was walking toward them. She was back in her armor, a sharp, gray power suit and heels that clicked rhythmically against the floor. Her face was a mask of cold professionalism. Grant immediately straightened his tie and flashed a plastic smile. "Miss Sterling," Grant said, "I was just telling Elias here about our policy on communal spaces. We really need to maintain a certain standard." Claire didn't look at Grant. She didn't look at the crowd. She walked straight to Elias's table. She looked at the grilled cheese sandwich sitting on the foil. "Is that the one you were telling me about?" Claire asked. Elias blinked, confused. "Yes, Leo's favorite." Claire reached down. Without a word, she picked up half of the sandwich. The crowd gasped. Tiffany's mouth actually dropped open. Claire took a deliberate bite. She chewed slowly, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. Elias held his breath. "It's excellent," Claire said. She took another bite, then wiped a small crumb from her lip. "In fact, it's better than any gala dinner I've attended this year. It has something those meals usually lack." Grant's smile faltered. "Miss Sterling, I'm sure he could have gone to the deli." "You don't have to. I don't have to." "What, Grant?" Claire asked. She turned to face him for the first time. Her voice was like a blade. "I just meant, it's not exactly the image we want to project," Grant stammered. Claire stepped closer to him. She was shorter than Grant, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over him. "You think a man caring for his son is a bad image?" Claire asked. "You think the person who keeps our records in perfect order is a beggar because he doesn't spend $20 on a salad every day?" "No, I was just joking around," Grant said, his face turning a blotchy red. "You weren't joking," Claire said. "You were being cruel. You were looking for a way to feel powerful by picking on someone you think is beneath you." She looked at the 30 employees standing behind Grant. Her gaze was enough to make most of them look at their shoes. "I've been watching how you treat people, Grant," Claire continued. "I've seen the way you talk about liabilities and burdens. It makes me wonder if you're actually capable of managing human resources at all. Because from where I'm standing, you look pathetic." Grant opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Tiffany, but she was busy looking at a spot on the wall. The crowd began to drift away. People who had been laughing seconds ago were suddenly very interested in their phones or their own lunches. Within a minute, Grant was standing alone in the middle of the cafeteria, his face a deep shade of purple. Claire turned back to Elias. The coldness in her eyes didn't vanish, but it softened just enough for him to see the woman from the sofa. "I'd like the recipe for this, Elias," Claire said. "I think the secret is just a lot of butter," Elias said. "I'll remember that," Claire replied. She didn't stay to chat. She turned and walked out of the cafeteria, her heels clicking just as firmly as when she arrived. Elias sat at the table, clutching the other half of his sandwich. He looked around the room. For the first time in 4 years, people weren't whispering or pointing. Some people actually nodded at him. He took a bite of his lunch. It was cold and a little smashed, but it tasted like the best meal he had ever had. For the first time since Sarah died, Elias didn't feel like a man drowning. He felt seen. He felt safe. He looked at the empty space where Claire had stood and realized that Leo was right. The star wasn't going anywhere. Grant retreated toward the elevators, his shoulders hunched. Elias didn't feel the need to gloat. He just felt a strange, quiet peace. He finished his sandwich, wrapped the foil into a neat ball, and headed back to the basement. The elevator doors opened, and for the first time, he didn't lower his gaze. He kept his head up. The peace Elias felt after the cafeteria incident stayed with him through the rest of the week. He finally felt like he could breathe at work without looking over his shoulder for Grant. But that feeling was tested on Thursday afternoon when he had to drive 40 miles south to San Jose to audit a satellite storage facility. By 2 p.m., Elias was deep in the aisles of a warehouse, surrounded by steel shelves and humming server racks. His phone was in his pocket, but the signal inside the metal-clad building was weak. Back in Oakland, the small house was quiet except for the sound of the television. Leo was on the sofa, clutching his stomach. The dull ache he had felt since lunch had sharpened into a hot, stabbing pain in his lower right side. He tried to sit up, but the movement made him gasp. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the cartoon on the screen. He reached for the glass of water on the coffee table, but his hand shook so hard he knocked it over. "Dad?" Leo whispered to the empty room. He looked at the clock. It was too early for Elias to be home. Leo tapped the screen of his Apple Watch. He scrolled to his father's name, but then he stopped. He remembered the cafeteria. He remembered Grant Harrison's loud, mean voice calling him a burden and a liability. He remembered how white his father's face had turned when Grant said he was a drain on the company. If I call him, he has to leave work, Leo thought. If he leaves work, the mean man will fire him. The pain surged again, making Leo curl into a ball. He couldn't be the reason his dad lost his job. He couldn't be a burden anymore. But he was scared, and the house felt too big and too lonely. He scrolled past his father's contact. He stopped at the name he had saved only a few days ago. The Guardian. He tapped the call button. In San Francisco, 50 floors above the street, the boardroom of Sterling Genomics was tense. Claire Sterling sat at the head of a massive mahogany table. Across from her were 6 representatives from a global pharmaceutical giant. They were finalizing a billion-dollar merger that had been in the works for 18 months. The EBITDA projections for the third quarter are solid. Claire, one of the consultants said, pointing at a slide. But we need you to sign off on the intellectual property transfer before the market closes. Claire stared at the screen, her face a mask of professional indifference. Her phone, sitting face up on the table, began to vibrate. Every head in the room turned toward it. It was a breach of protocol. Claire never allowed personal devices to interrupt high-stakes negotiations. She went to silence it, but she saw the name on the screen. The Guardian. Claire felt a cold jolt of electricity hit her stomach. She knew that contact name. She had seen Leo type it in. She didn't hesitate. She stood up, knocking her heavy leather chair back. Miss Sterling? We're in the middle of the final clause, the lead attorney said. Claire didn't look at him. She swiped the screen and put the phone to her ear. Leo? What is it? It hurts, Leo's voice came through, tiny and wet with tears. My tummy. It's the hot pain, Claire. Please don't tell Dad. I don't want him to get in trouble with the HR man. I don't want to be a burden. Claire felt her heart hammer against her ribs. The billion-dollar deal, the lawyers, the power, it all vanished in a second. I'm coming, Leo. I'm coming right now, Claire said. Is the door locked? I think so. I have the emergency code your dad gave the office. Stay on the sofa. Don't move. She hung up and grabbed her handbag. The men in the room were staring at her in total shock. Claire, we have a deadline, the senior partner said, standing up. If you walk out now, the deal is dead. Claire looked at him. Then let it die. I have something more important to do. She walked out of the boardroom without another word. She didn't wait for her driver. She ran to the elevator, her heart thumping in her ears. When she reached the parking garage, she jumped into her car and peeled out onto the street. It was 2:15 p.m. The Bay Bridge was already starting to clog with early rush-hour traffic. Claire gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She wove through the lanes, her eyes fixed on the Oakland skyline across the water. She wasn't the CEO of Sterling Genomics right now. She was just a woman who had made a promise to a star. Don't be scared, Leo, she whispered to herself. I'm almost there. She hit the bridge, the tires humming over the metal grates. She looked at the clock. It was 20 miles to Oakland. Elias was 40 miles away in San Jose. He couldn't get there in time, and Leo was alone. Claire pushed the accelerator down. She didn't care about the speed cameras or the sirens. She just cared about the little boy who was too afraid to call his own father because of a cruel man in a suit. She reached the house in record time. She sprinted up the porch steps, her heels clicking loudly on the wood. She punched in the code and burst through the door. Leo! She found him on the sofa, pale and shivering. Claire dropped to her knees on the floor, not caring about her silk suit. She touched his forehead. It was burning. I'm here, she said, her voice shaking. You're okay. We're going to the hospital. Did you tell Dad? Leo gasped. Not yet, Claire said, lifting him into her arms. But I'm going to take care of everything. I promise. She carried him to the car, her mind racing. She had never been so terrified in her life. Not during board meetings, not during hostile takeovers. This was different. This was real. She pulled away from the curb, heading for the bridge and the hospital, praying she was fast enough. The drive from San Jose had been a blur of white knuckles and frantic lane changes. Elias had ignored every speed limit, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made it hard to breathe. By the time he sprinted through the sliding glass doors of Stanford Children's Hospital, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his legs felt like lead. He didn't stop at the desk. He followed the text Claire had sent him 10 minutes ago. He turned the corner into the pediatric surgical wing and stopped. The hallway was quiet, lit by the clinical hum of overhead lights. In the middle of the corridor, Sitting in a row of hard, blue plastic chairs was Claire Sterling. Elias stood frozen. The woman sitting there wasn't the Iron Lady of the financial district. She looked like she had been through a disaster. Her Lua Longley blouse, a designer piece that probably cost more than Elias made in a month, was ruined. There was a large, drying stain of vomit across her shoulder and a splatter of porridge down the front where Leo must have leaned on her. Her blonde hair, usually pinned in a perfect bun, was falling in messy strands around her face. But it was her feet that made Elias's breath catch. Her black Louboutins, the famous red-soled shoes that were her trademark, were tossed carelessly under the plastic chair. Claire was sitting there barefoot, her toes pressing against the cold, gray stone floor. She looked small. She looked human. She was leaning forward, her hand gripped tightly around Leo's small hand. Leo was lying in a mobile hospital bed next to her, looking pale and drowsy from the pain medication. "Claire?" Elias whispered. Claire looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and for a second, the mask of the CEO flickered. She looked relieved. She didn't stand up. She just let out a long, shaky breath. "He's okay, Elias," Claire said. "The doctors say it was appendicitis. They caught it just in time. He's going into surgery in 20 minutes. Elias stumbled forward and sank into the chair next to her. He looked at his son, whose eyes were fluttering open. "Leo. Hey, buddy. I'm here." Leo looked at his father. Then his gaze drifted to Claire. He tried to squeeze Elias's hand, but he didn't have much strength. "Dad? Don't be mad," Leo said, his voice a tiny, raspy thread. "I'm not mad, Leo. Why would I be mad? I called Claire, Leo Thotha. I didn't call you. I remembered what the man at your work said. Grant. He said I was a gonnung. He said I was a drain on the money. I thought if I called you and you had to leave work, he would fire you. I didn't want to be a burden anymore." Elias felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He looked at his 7-year-old son, realizing the weight the boy had been carrying. The cruelty of Grant Harrison had reached into a child's heart and made him afraid to ask for help while his body was failing. "You are never a burden, Leo," Elias said, his voice breaking. "Never. Do you hear me? I don't care about that job. I don't care about Grant. You are the only thing that matters." "Claire said that too," Leo whispered. "She said she'd handle the mean man." Leo's eyes drifted shut as the nurse arrived to wheel the bed toward the operating room. Elias stood up to follow, but the nurse gave him a sympathetic look and told him he had to stay in the waiting area. As the doors swung shut behind Leo, Elias turned back to Claire. She was still sitting there, barefoot on the hospital floor, looking at her stained silk sleeves. Elias didn't know what to say. He looked at the most powerful woman in the city, a woman who had abandoned a billion-dollar merger to drive his son to the hospital. He saw the puke on her clothes and the dirt on her feet. "You stayed," Elias said. "Of course I stayed," Claire said. "You're covered in." "Everything," Elias said, gesturing to her blouse. "And your shoes. The floor is freezing, Claire." "I didn't even notice," Claire said. She looked down at her bare feet as if seeing them for the first time. "I just wanted to get him inside. He was so small in the car, Elias. He was trying so hard not to cry because he didn't want to be trouble." It broke my heart. Elias felt a sob build in his throat. He couldn't hold it back anymore. He dropped to his knees on the cold floor in front of her. He didn't care who saw them. He wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face in her stained blouse. Claire stiffened for a fraction of a second. Then her arms came around him. She held his head against her shoulder, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. Elias felt her heart beating against his ear, fast and steady. "Thank you," Elias choked out. "Thank you for saving him. Thank you for being there when I couldn't be." "I told you," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm his star, remember?" Elias pulled back just enough to look at her. He saw the tears in her eyes, matching his own. He realized that this woman, who had everything the world could offer, was currently sitting in a hallway ding vait non, barefoot and exhausted, because she cared about a filing clerk and his son. "Grant is going to have a lot to answer for," Claire said, her eyes turning hard for a moment. "But that's for later. Right now, we just wait for Leo." Elias took her hands in his. Her skin was cold from the hospital air, but her grip was firm. He didn't feel like a man gongan katejur anymore. For the first time in 4 years, someone else was holding the other end of the load. "Let me get you some socks or something," Elias said, trying to wipe his eyes. "You're going to get sick." "I'm fine, Elias," Claire said. She gave him a small, weary smile. "Sit with me. Just sit." He sat back down next to her. They sat in the silence of the Stanford hallway, their hands locked together. Elias looked at the Louboutins under the chair and then at Claire's bare feet. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. He realized then that the message he had sent by mistake hadn't just changed his career, it had saved his family. They waited together in the quiet. Two fragments of a soul finally finding their place, while the world of Sterling Genomics and San Francisco Power felt a million miles away. Leo's recovery at Stanford had been faster than the doctors expected. 2 weeks after the surgery, the color had returned to his cheeks and the spark was back in his eyes. The terror of that night in the hospital hallway had faded, replaced by a quiet, steady bond that had formed between the three of them. Elias no longer felt like he was walking on eggshells at work, and Claire no longer looked like she was carrying the weight of a skyscraper on her shoulders. On a warm Saturday afternoon, they headed to Golden Gate Park. The sun was bright, and the grass was a deep, healthy green. Claire had traded her silk suits and Louboutins for a pair of light blue jeans and a simple white t-shirt. She looked younger, her blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Leo was running ahead of them, a bright orange frisbee gripped in his hand. He stopped at a small vendor stall near the entrance and pointed at something. "Dad! Claire! Look!" Leo shouted. Elias and Claire caught up to him. The vendor was selling light-up headbands and plastic toys. Leo reached for a pair of fuzzy, pink bunny ears. "You want those, buddy?" Elias asked. "No," Leo said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "I want Claire to wear them." Elias looked at Claire, waiting for the CEO of Sterling Genomics to politely decline. Instead, Claire laughed. She took the pink bunny ears from the vendor, clicked the switch so they started to blink, and slid them onto her head. "How do I look?" Claire asked. "You look like a giant rabbit," Leo said, giggling. "Then, let's go play, Leo," Claire said. They found a wide stretch of grass near the Conservatory of Flowers. For an hour, they ran and laughed. Elias threw the frisbee, and Claire chased after it with Leo, the pink ears flopping back and forth as she ran. When they got tired, they spread out a blanket and opened 2 large pizza boxes. "This is better than the cafeteria," Elias said, handing Claire a slice of pepperoni pizza. "I'm never eating a kale salad again," Claire replied. They were laughing at something Leo said when 2 figures walked toward their blanket. Elias recognized the expensive, tailored shorts and the polo shirt immediately. It was Grant Harrison. Tiffany was with him, wearing a sundress and holding a designer handbag. Grant stopped a few feet away. He looked at Elias. Then his gaze moved to Claire. He stared at the pink bunny ears on her head, a sneer forming on his face. "Miss Sterling?" Grant asked. "Is this some kind of new corporate strategy, the humanized CEO look?" Tiffany giggled, clutching Grant's arm. "I almost didn't recognize you without the blazer, Claire. And the ears, they're a choice." Elias felt the old spark of anger in his chest. He started to stand up, but Claire stayed seated. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look annoyed. She looked at Grant and Tiffany as if they were 2 strangers she had never met before. "Do I know you?" Claire asked. Grant's smile faltered. "It's Grant. From HR? We've worked together for 6 years." Claire took a bite of her pizza and chewed slowly. She didn't look away. "I remember a man in HR who spent his time making fun of employees' children. I don't remember seeing anyone like that in my park on a Saturday." "You're blocking the sun, Mr. Harrison. We're having a family lunch." "Family?" Tiffany asked, her eyes darting to Elias. "With a filing clerk?" Claire turned her attention back to Leo. "Leo, do you think we should go to the aquarium after this?" "Yeah, I want to see the sharks," Leo said. Grant stood there, his face turning a dark shade of red. He had come over expecting to embarrass Elias, to make a joke about the Iron Lady losing her mind. But Claire wasn't playing the game. She wasn't defending herself or Elias. She was simply acting like Grant didn't exist. His words had no power. He looked ridiculous standing there in his expensive clothes while they sat on the grass, happy and indifferent to him. "You're making a mistake, Claire," Grant muttered. "The board is going to hear about how you're spending your time." Claire didn't even look up. "Goodbye, Grant." As Grant and Tiffany turned to leave, a large group of people walked toward the blanket from the other direction. It was a group of about 30 employees from Sterling Genomics. They were part of a weekend hiking club Elias had heard about but never been invited to join. "Elias?" one of the men called out. It was Dave from the IT department. "Hey, man, good to see you out." The group stopped. They saw Claire in her bunny ears and Elias with his pizza. "Is the kid doing okay?" a woman from the marketing team asked. "We heard about the hospital visit. We were all worried." "He's doing great," Elias said, standing up to shake Dave's hand. "He's back to his old self." "That's awesome," Dave said. He looked at Claire and gave a respectful nod. "Great day for a picnic, Miss Sterling." "It really is," Claire said, smiling warmly at the group. "Elias tells me you guys have a great hiking route today." "We do." "You guys should join us next time," Dave said. He looked at Grant, who was standing a few yards away, looking frustrated. Dave ignored him and turned back to Elias. "See you Monday, Elias. Glad Leo is better." The group moved on, chatting and laughing. Elias sat back down. He looked at Grant and Tiffany, who were now walking away quickly, their shoulders hunched. The hiking club hadn't even looked at Grant. The 30 people who usually followed his lead at the office had walked right past him to check on the filing clerk. Elias realized then that the Ice Queen hadn't just protected him, she had changed the world around him. The happiness they shared on that blanket was a shield. Grant's cruelty was silent because it no longer had an audience. "Sharks next?" Claire asked, adjusting her pink ears. "Sharks next!" Leo shouted. Elias looked at Claire and smiled. He didn't feel like an employee, and she didn't look like a CEO. They were just people in a park, safe and together. He reached over and took her hand. Claire squeezed back, her eyes bright with a joy that no boardroom could ever provide. The silence of the afternoon was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, Elias knew that everything was going to be more than okay. 6 months had passed since the afternoon at Golden Gate Park, and the rhythm of life had shifted into something steady and quiet. The skyscrapers of the financial district still dominated the skyline, and Sterling Genomics was still a billion-dollar empire. But the house in Oakland was the true center of the world now. The peeling wallpaper had been replaced, and the smell of old soup gas had given way to fresh coffee and the scent of the garden Claire was learning to tend on the weekends. It was nearly 8 p.m. on a Thursday. Elias was in the kitchen, putting the final touches on a batch of grilled cheese sandwiches. He heard the familiar hum of the car in the driveway. A minute later, the front door opened, and Claire stepped into the living room. She looked spent. Her blonde hair was starting to escape her neat bun, and her shoulders were slumped. She dropped her handbag on the side table and leaned against the wall. Her eyes closed. The high-stakes meetings with the board and the constant pressure of the industry had taken their toll today. "Rough day?" Elias asked, walking into the room. "The merger in London is hitting a wall," Claire said. "The lawyers spent 6 hours arguing over a single paragraph. I think my brain is actually vibrating." "You're home now," Elias said. "The lawyers can't get in here." Claire opened her eyes and looked at him. She gave a small, weary smile. "That is the best thing I've heard all day." She started to walk toward the sofa, but she winced with every step. Her black high heels clicked sharply on the wooden floor. She had been standing and walking in them for 12 hours. Elias saw the pain in her face. He didn't say anything. He went to the closet, grabbed a pair of soft, blue fleece slippers, and walked back to her. "Sit down, Claire," Elias said. Claire sat on the edge of the sofa. Elias knelt on the floor at her feet. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out and gently took her right heel in his hand. He unbuckled the thin strap and slid the shoe off. He did the same with the left. He set the expensive Louboutins aside, where they looked small and unimportant on the rug. "Elias, you don't have to do that," Claire said. "I want to," Elias replied. He took her right foot in his hands. His palms were rough from years of manual work and household chores, a sharp contrast to her soft skin. He began to massage the arch of her foot, his thumbs moving in slow, firm circles. He felt the tension in her muscles begin to melt. Claire let out a long, shaky sigh. She leaned her head back against the sofa cushions. "Oh, I forgot what it felt like to have blood flowing to my toes. You spend too much time in those things," Elias said. "They're built for intimidation, not for comfort." "They are my armor," Claire said. "It's hard to be the Iron Lady in flats." "You don't have to be the Iron Lady here," Elias said. "Here, you're just Claire. And Claire deserves to be comfortable." He moved his hands to her left foot, working through the knots near her ankle. He was focused and methodical, putting all his care into the motion. Claire watched him, her expression softening. The billionaire CEO and the filing clerk was a story the newspapers would have loved, but in this moment, those titles meant nothing. There was just a man taking care of a woman he loved. When he was finished, he slid the soft slippers onto her feet. The blue fleece looked cozy against the hem of her expensive suit pants. Elias stayed on his knees for a moment, looking up at her. "Better?" Elias asked. "Much better," Claire said. "Thank you, Elias. Really." He sat up on the sofa next to her. The house was quiet. Leo was in his room, probably reading a book about black holes. The neighborhood outside was still. "I was thinking about something today," Elias said. "It's been almost a year since that Tuesday afternoon." Claire turned her head to look at him. "The afternoon you tried to ruin your life with a text message?" "Exactly that one," Elias said. "I still can't believe I hit send. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at that bucket of water, thinking I had just destroyed everything. I was so sure you were going to call the police or have Grant throw me out of the building." Claire reached over and took his hand. She ran her thumb over his knuckles. "I remember getting it. I was in a board meeting. Grant was talking about quarterly projections, and I was bored out of my mind. Then my phone buzzed. I read your message, and I just sat there for a minute." "What did you think?" Elias asked. "Honestly, I thought it was a prank at first," Claire admitted. "Then I looked at your file, I saw your face, and I remembered the tea bag you left on my desk. I realized it wasn't a prank. It was a cry for help from a person who was just as lonely as I was." "I felt so stupid," Elias said. "I thought I had sent a death warrant to my career." Claire leaned closer, her shoulder pressing against his. She looked at the slippers on her feet and then at the room around them. "You know," Claire said, "I've spent my whole life being told that mistakes are failures. My father taught me that a Sterling never misses a step. But that text message, it's the only reason I'm here." "I'm glad I'm a bad typist then," Elias said. "Me too," Claire replied. "About that text, Elias, you said you wanted to know what it felt like to feel safe. Do you know now?" Elias looked at her, then at the hallway where his son was safe and healthy. He felt the warmth of the house and the steady beat of his own heart. "I do. I feel safe every time I hear your car in the drive." Claire closed her eyes and rested her head on his shoulder. "That text message didn't lead me to an employee, Elias. It led me home." The door to the bedroom opened, and Leo walked out, rubbing his eyes. He was wearing his pajamas with the little rocket ships on them. He saw Claire and his face lit up. "Claire, you're back!" Leo said. "I'm back!" "Leo!" Claire said, reaching out an arm. Leo scrambled onto the sofa between them, snuggling into the space. The three of them sat there together, a small family unit held together by a mistake and a lot of courage. "Can we look at the stars tonight?" Leo asked. "The sky is really clear." "I think that's a great idea," Claire said. Elias stood up and helped them both toward the back porch. They stood under the vast Oakland sky, looking through the telescope at the bright, distant points of light. There were no grand declarations, there were no dramatic speeches or cameras, there was just the cool night air, the sound of Leo explaining a nebula, and the feeling of Claire's hand in Elias's. They were safe. They were together, and for the first time in their lives, they didn't need anything else. And that is our bedtime story for tonight. A journey that began with a terrifying mistake at 3:17 p.m. and ended with a quiet, beautiful peace in an Oakland living room. How did this story make you feel? Was it the moment Claire stood barefoot in the hospital hallway, or when Elias finally thou doi gyai cow got for the woman who saved his world? We would love to hear which part of their journey touched your heart the most. This story serves as a gentle reminder that our greatest blunders can often be the keys to our greatest happiness. It teaches us that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a bridge to connection. In a world that often demands we be iron ladies or supermen, the bravest thing we can ever do is admit when we are tired and find a place where we finally feel safe. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We know there are so many single dad stories out there, but Elias's journey reminds us of the quiet heroism found in every single dad. It's a reminder that no matter how heavy the world feels, you don't have to carry it alone forever. If you enjoyed this story, please let us know. And remember that sometimes the best things in life arrive in the form of a misdirected text. Good night and sleep tight.